There is a kind of pain avoidants never prepare for because they spend most of their lives learning how to escape discomfort instead of facing it. They learn to step back when emotions become intense, to disconnect when vulnerability feels too close, and to disappear emotionally when connection begins asking something deeper from them. Somewhere inside, they convince themselves that distance protects them, silence keeps them safe, and emotional independence means strength. But the one thing they never expect is the moment a super empath finally walks away and never returns. That moment hits differently because for the first time, the person who understood them, waited for them, and tried endlessly to understand their fears chooses peace instead of pursuit. A super empath does not leave quickly. That is one of the biggest misunderstandings avoidants have. They assume if someone is still around after repeated disappointments, emotional withdrawal, mixed signals, and emotional inconsistency, then that person will probably stay forever. They mistake patience for permanence. They mistake understanding for endless tolerance. They fail to realize that every ignored feeling leaves a mark. Every cold moment creates emotional distance. And every time someone feels emotionally abandoned, something inside them begins quietly changing. The super empath usually fights for the connection long after most people would have walked away. They explain, they understand, they forgive, and they keep trying to see the wounded side behind difficult behavior. But eventually, even the strongest heart reaches a limit where survival becomes more important than sacrifice. The avoidant often feels secure in the idea that the empath will remain emotionally available no matter what happens. Deep down, even if they never say it, they become emotionally dependent on the consistency of someone they constantly take for granted. They know this person notices the little things. They know this person understands moods, hidden sadness, emotional shutdowns, and invisible struggles. They know there is someone who stays calm when things become emotionally difficult. Yet because this safety feels permanent, they stop protecting it. They begin assuming it will always be there, no matter how emotionally distant they become. What avoidants rarely understand is that the super empath starts grieving long before the relationship officially ends. While the avoidant is withdrawing emotionally, avoiding conversations, or pretending everything is fine, the empath is quietly breaking inside. They replay moments in their mind, trying to understand what changed. They blame themselves first because empathy often turns inward before it points outward. They wonder if they became too emotional, too caring, too sensitive, or too demanding. They spend nights mentally reviewing conversations, hoping they somehow misunderstood the emotional distance. But over time, reality becomes impossible to ignore. Patterns begin replacing excuses, and disappointment slowly replaces hope. The most dangerous moment in the relationship is not when the super empath cries or expresses frustration. The dangerous moment comes when they stop reacting completely. That silence is different. It feels calm, but underneath that calmness, something permanent has shifted. The empath has finally accepted the truth that effort cannot heal someone unwilling to participate emotionally. They realize love cannot survive one-sided emotional labor forever. They stop trying to fix things, not because they stopped caring, but because they are exhausted from carrying the emotional weight of two people. When the super empath finally walks away, the avoidant often does not understand the seriousness of it immediately. At first, they may feel relief. Space feels comfortable. Distance feels familiar. They tell themselves things probably became too intense anyway. They distract themselves and continue life as if nothing major happened. But avoidants have one problem they never talk about openly. Their emotions usually arrive late. What other people feel immediately, they often feel months later when silence becomes loud enough to hear. The first unexpected pain begins with absence. The avoidant slowly notices something missing in their everyday life. Nobody checks in the same way anymore. Nobody notices emotional shifts without explanation. Nobody understands silence the way the super empath once did. Small things suddenly feel strange. Good news feels emptier because there is no one who genuinely celebrated every tiny success. Hard days feel colder because the emotional safety they once had no longer exists. At first, they try ignoring this feeling, but emotional emptiness has a way of growing louder over time. Then comes memory, and memory becomes brutal. Certain songs, places, routines, or even random moments start triggering reminders of the person they lost. They remember details they once overlooked. The kindness they barely acknowledged suddenly becomes unforgettable. The patience they once expected begins looking rare. The emotional support they ignored starts feeling impossible to replace. Human beings often fail to understand value while receiving it because consistency becomes invisible when it feels permanent. Only when something disappears completely do people begin recognizing how deeply it mattered. The avoidant begins comparing every future connection to what they lost, even if they never admit it aloud. New conversations feel surface level. Emotional connection feels weaker. Small misunderstandings turn into frustration because most people do not have the emotional patience of a super empath. Most people refuse to endlessly explain themselves. Most people leave when emotional inconsistency becomes painful. The avoidant slowly starts realizing they did not lose something ordinary. They lost someone unusually rare, someone capable of seeing brokenness without immediately turning away. Regret becomes heavier because it feels preventable. It was not some massive betrayal that destroyed the connection. It was accumulation, repeated emotional absence, repeated dismissiveness, repeated withdrawal, missed opportunities to communicate, missed chances to grow. Little moments that seemed harmless at the time slowly became emotional damage. The avoidant eventually realizes the relationship did not collapse overnight. It slowly starved because emotional closeness cannot survive neglect forever. One of the deepest pains avoidants experience after the super empath leaves is identity pain. Deep inside, many avoidants carry hidden beliefs that they are hard to love, difficult to understand, or emotionally flawed. They protect themselves through distance because rejection feels terrifying. But when the person who loved them despite their flaws finally leaves, something painful happens. Old fears suddenly feel real. They begin wondering if maybe they really were impossible to love. That thought creates emotional discomfort they cannot easily escape because it attacks the story they secretly believe about themselves. What hurts even more is realizing the super empath did not leave dramatically. There was no chaos to blame, no screaming match to justify emotional distance, no explosive betrayal creating an easy villain. Instead, there was calmness, quiet acceptance, emotional closure. The super empath simply reached a point where self-respect became stronger than emotional attachment. That kind of ending feels terrifying because consequences become impossible to deny. The avoidant can no longer hide behind excuses. They are forced to confront a painful truth. Someone who genuinely loved them stopped trying because repeated emotional neglect finally became unbearable. The super empath eventually reaches a state many people misunderstand. They stop romanticizing potential and start accepting reality. They stop focusing on who someone could become and begin seeing who they consistently choose to be. That shift changes everything because once clarity arrives, emotional confusion disappears. The empath no longer chases emotional breadcrumbs. They stop interpreting silence as hidden love. They stop waiting for effort that never arrives. They stop sacrificing emotional peace, trying to save someone from themselves. The avoidant notices this change, and it unsettles them deeply. The warmth feels different. The emotional energy feels distant. The person who once tried endlessly now seems calm, detached, and peaceful. That peace becomes painful because peace sounds permanent. Anger would feel easier. Arguments would feel easier, emotional intensity would feel easier, but peace feels final, and finality forces reflection. Eventually, another painful realization arrives. Someone else will likely receive everything they once took for granted. Someone emotionally mature will eventually experience the loyalty, patience, emotional depth, and understanding they ignored. Someone willing to communicate will receive the effort they failed to appreciate. The avoidant imagines another person experiencing the emotional safety they once had access to, and suddenly loss becomes painfully real. The future they could have built begins haunting them because now it belongs to possibility instead of reality. The hardest truth avoidants face after a super empath walks away is understanding that love alone was never the problem. The super empath cared deeply. They stayed longer than most people ever would. They tried harder than they should have. But care without reciprocity eventually becomes emotional exhaustion. Even the strongest heart grows tired of carrying relationships alone. At some point, survival becomes necessary, and the empath quietly chooses healing over heartbreak. Avoidants never expect the pain because they mistake emotional patience for emotional permanence. They believe understanding means endless chances. They believe someone who loves deeply will never stop trying. But eventually, even the kindest people stop setting themselves on fire to keep someone else emotionally warm. When that day comes, the silence feels different. It carries consequence. It carries regret. And for the avoidant, it carries the painful realization that the one person who truly saw them, decided loving themselves, mattered more than waiting forever. After the super empath walks away, the avoidant often enters a strange emotional phase where they try convincing themselves everything is fine. On the surface, life continues. They stay busy, distract themselves, bury emotions beneath routines, entertainment, work, temporary attention, or emotional numbness. They tell themselves the relationship probably would not have worked anyway. They replay reasons to justify distance because facing accountability feels far more uncomfortable than protecting pride. But emotional avoidance has one major weakness. Feelings delayed are never feelings erased. They wait quietly beneath the surface, building pressure, until silence becomes impossible to ignore. Time begins revealing things the avoidant could not see while emotionally disconnected. They start remembering moments differently. Situations they once dismissed suddenly look painful. The empath asking for communication no longer feels dramatic. The emotional conversations they once avoided suddenly sound reasonable. They begin noticing how often someone was trying to build closeness while they were quietly building walls. Memory becomes painful because hindsight removes excuses. What once felt normal starts looking emotionally unfair, and regret grows stronger when someone finally understands the damage after the person is already gone. The avoidant slowly starts noticing the emotional emptiness left behind in places they never expected. During difficult moments, there is no one instinctively offering comfort. During exciting moments, there is no one celebrating with genuine excitement. The emotional presence they once assumed would always exist suddenly feels irreplaceable. Humans adapt quickly to emotional safety, and when that safety disappears, life feels strangely colder. Small moments feel heavier because emotional support often becomes visible only through absence. One of the biggest pains avoidants never expect is realizing the super empath truly understood them in ways very few people ever will. The empath understood moods without explanation. They sensed sadness behind silence, fear behind distance, and insecurity beneath cold behavior. Instead of immediately judging emotional withdrawal, they tried understanding it. Instead of punishing emotional inconsistency, they gave patience. That level of emotional intelligence feels rare because most people eventually protect themselves much earlier. Losing someone who genuinely saw hidden pain without abandoning them creates a type of loneliness that feels difficult to explain. As time passes, dating or meeting new people often becomes unexpectedly frustrating for avoidants. At first, distractions feel exciting, attention feels validating, temporary connection feels enough, but eventually patterns emerge. New people have boundaries. They become frustrated faster. They communicate differently. They expect emotional availability. They refuse to endlessly tolerate emotional inconsistency. Slowly, the avoidant realizes the super empath offered unusual emotional grace, something most people are neither willing nor emotionally capable of providing forever. Regret deepens because the avoidant starts replaying memories they once overlooked. The little gestures suddenly matter. Support during difficult days becomes unforgettable. Emotional patience starts looking extraordinary. The kindness they barely acknowledged becomes impossible to stop thinking about. Human psychology works strangely sometimes. People often overlook emotional reliability while they have it because familiarity creates blindness. But once something disappears permanently, memory starts highlighting every detail that was taken for granted. At some point, many avoidants experience an emotional contradiction they never expected. They start missing intimacy while still fearing vulnerability. Part of them wants closeness again, but another part remains terrified of emotional exposure. This creates internal conflict because they finally understand what they lost, yet still struggle with the behaviors that caused the loss in the first place. Awareness without emotional growth becomes painful because recognizing mistakes does not automatically heal emotional patterns. Meanwhile, the super empath usually changes in ways the avoidant never imagined. People assume empathy means weakness, but often the deepest pain creates the strongest transformation. After repeated emotional disappointment, the empath begins rebuilding themselves. They stop over-explaining. They stop tolerating emotional inconsistency. They learn boundaries. They rediscover self-respect. They stop chasing emotionally unavailable people, hoping love alone will create change. What once looked like endless patience becomes wisdom. This transformation often shocks the avoidant if they reconnect or observe from a distance. The empath no longer seems emotionally desperate. The emotional softness remains, but now it exists beside strength. The kindness still exists, but now it comes with boundaries. The warmth remains, but access to it feels earned instead of automatic. For the first time, the avoidant realizes something painful. The version of the empath who waited endlessly no longer exists. That realization hurts because avoidants often assume time freezes emotional availability. They secretly believe someone who loved deeply will remain emotionally accessible forever. But healing changes people. Healing teaches self-protection. Healing teaches standards. The super empath eventually understands that understanding someone's wounds does not mean accepting emotional neglect forever. The avoidant begins experiencing another painful emotion they rarely discuss openly, and that emotion is guilt. Not dramatic guilt, but quiet guilt. The kind that arrives unexpectedly at night. The kind that appears during moments of loneliness. They think about times they dismissed emotional conversations, times they withdrew without explanation, times they ignored effort because vulnerability felt uncomfortable. Guilt feels heavier when someone realizes the damage was avoidable, especially when the person they hurt genuinely tried to love them well. What becomes especially painful is understanding the super empath never wanted perfection. They wanted effort, communication, honesty, emotional participation. They stayed through flaws. They stayed through confusion. They stayed through emotional distance longer than most people ever would have. The avoidant slowly realizes they were not expected to become perfect overnight. They were only expected to show willingness, and that realization creates another wave of regret because willingness feels so small compared to permanent loss. The avoidant may even attempt reconnection at some point, hoping enough time has passed to reopen emotional access. But often what they meet feels unfamiliar. The empath responds calmly, respectfully, kindly, yet differently. There is emotional distance now. Not cruelty, not bitterness, just clarity. The emotional door that once stood wide open now feels partially closed. This confuses the avoidant because they expected familiar warmth, familiar patience, familiar emotional availability. Instead, they meet someone who finally learned to protect their peace. The hardest thing for avoidants to accept is that consequences do not always arrive immediately. Sometimes they arrive quietly months later, disguised as loneliness, comparison, regret, and emotional emptiness. Sometimes the pain arrives while watching someone else appreciate what they ignored. Sometimes it arrives through self-reflection after realizing emotional distance protected fear but destroyed connection. Delayed pain feels cruel because by the time understanding arrives, opportunities are often gone. There comes a moment when the avoidant fully understands what happened. The super empath did not leave because love disappeared. They left because self-respect finally grew stronger than emotional suffering. They left because endless understanding without reciprocity became exhausting. They left because carrying emotional connection alone slowly became unbearable. That realization changes everything because suddenly the story feels different. It was never about someone abandoning them unfairly. It was about someone finally choosing themselves after trying for too long. The painful truth avoidants struggle accepting is that the super empath usually gave more chances than anyone else ever will. They stayed longer, forgave more, tried harder, understood deeper. When someone like that walks away, it is rarely impulsive. It usually means emotional exhaustion reached a level where staying became more painful than leaving. By the time they finally go, they are not looking backward anymore. They are trying to heal. And this becomes the deepest unexpected pain of all. The avoidant realizes too late that emotional safety was never guaranteed. The person who loved them through confusion, fear, silence, and inconsistency eventually stopped sacrificing themselves to save someone unwilling to face their own emotional walls. For the first time, the avoidant understands something heartbreaking. Love did exist. Patience did exist. Understanding did exist. But nothing, no matter how deep, survives forever without care.